Ready? We're just going to start right in. Deputy Clerk. Change of plea hearing. United States versus Michael Cohen. Counsel, please state your appearance. For the government, Rush Atkinson, who's a prosecutor working for the special counsel's office, stands up and says, "Good morning, Your Honor. Rush Atkinson on behalf of the United States. With me is my colleague Jeannie Rhee and my colleague Andrew Goldstein from the special counsel's office. We're joined by Special Agent Michelle Taylor from the FBI." The judge says, "And for the defendant?" Then we hear from Michael Cohen's defense counsel. For defendant Michael Cohen, Guy Petrillo and Amy Lester. Good morning, Your Honor. The judge says, "Good morning. My understanding is that Mr. Cohen would like to waive indictment and then plead guilty to a criminal information pursuant to an agreement with the government. Is that correct?" Cohen's defense lawyer, "That's correct, Your Honor." The judge, "Okay." The judge then says, "Please state your full name." The defendant says, "Michael Dean Cohen." The judge, "How old are you?" Cohen, 52. The judge, "How far did you go in school?" Cohen, JD degree. Judge, "Are you currently or have you recently been under the care of a physician?" Cohen, "No, sir." Judge, "Have you recently seen a psychiatrist or a psychologist or had any sort of mental health counseling?" Michael Cohen, "No, Your Honor." The judge, "Have you ever been treated for any psychiatric condition?" Cohen, "No, sir." Judge, "Have you ever been hospitalized for drug abuse or alcohol abuse?" Michael Cohen, "No, sir." The judge, "All right. Does defense counsel have any doubts about your client's competence to proceed?" Cohen's defense lawyer says, "I do not, Your Honor." The judge says, "Counsel for the government?" Prosecutor Rush Atkinson says, "No, Your Honor." The judge then says, "I find that Mr. Cohen appears alert. He has answered the questions appropriately. I find that he is competent to proceed, and we will continue." The judge says, quote, "Mr. Cohen, I want to make sure you understand that you're being charged with a felony offense. Do you understand, sir?" Michael Cohen, "I do, sir." The judge, "The sole count of the information charges false statements. It states, on or about August 28th, 2017, the defendant Michael Cohen in the District of Columbia and elsewhere in a matter within the jurisdiction of the legislative branch of the government of the United States knowingly and willfully made a materially false, fictitious, and fraudulent statement and representation. To wit, Cohen caused to be submitted a written statement to the Senate Intelligence Committee containing materially false statements about the Moscow Project, including false statements about the timing of the project, discussions with people in the company, the Trump Organization, and in Russia about the Moscow Project, and contemplated travel to Russia in connection with the Moscow Project." The judge says, "Do you understand the nature of that charge, Mr. Cohen?" Michael Cohen says, "I do, Your Honor." The judge, "Do you have any questions for me, Mr. Cohen, before we continue?" Cohen, "No, Your Honor." The judge, "Defense counsel, are you aware of any reason why your client should not plead guilty?" Defense counsel for Michael Cohen, Guy Petrillo, says, "No, Your Honor." The judge says, "Are you aware of any legal defense to the charge?" Cohen's defense lawyer, Guy Petrillo, says, "Not that would prevail at trial." The judge says, "Mr. Cohen, are you satisfied with your legal representation up to this point?" Michael Cohen, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge, "Mr. Cohen, are you willing to give up your rights to a trial and all the other rights we have discussed?" Cohen, "Yes, sir." The judge, "How do you plead to the sole count of the information?" Michael Cohen, "Guilty, Your Honor." And then it gets a little confusing. So the judge says, "How do you plead?" Michael Cohen says, "Guilty, Your Honor." Then the judge says, "Guilty or not guilty?" And then Michael Cohen says, "Sorry." And the judge says, "That's fine. Guilty?" And Michael Cohen says, "Yes, sir." He jumped in a little quick. "I really am here to plead guilty. I'd like to just get..." Sorry, were you not done? Guilty, did I say guilty? But then at this point in the proceedings is where the spotlight really turns on Michael Cohen. And this is a surprise proceeding. Everybody who's there in the courtroom has arrived on short notice. There's no advance press that this was going to happen. The plea says a little something, but now here's Michael Cohen in court, really getting to explain, put a little narrative on what's going on here. So the judge, after he's just pled guilty, the judge then turns to Michael Cohen and says to him, quote, "Okay, tell me what it is that you did that makes you guilty." Michael Cohen says, "So if I may stand, Your Honor, if I may stand up for it?" The judge says, "What's that?" Michael Cohen, "May I stand for you on this?" The judge, "You may. You don't need to. The acoustics aren't great. It may be easier if you sit and speak into the microphone." Michael Cohen, "Then that is what I shall do." The judge says, "All right, go ahead." Michael Cohen clears his throat. "Thank you. Prior to the 2016 presidential election, I had been the executive vice president and special counsel to Donald J. Trump at the Trump Organization, a Manhattan-based real estate business. By 2017, I was no longer employed in this capacity, but continued to serve on several matters as an attorney to the former CEO of the Trump Organization, who is now President of the United States. He is referred to as Individual One in the criminal information. As I had in the years before the election, I continued in 2017 to follow the day-to-day political messaging that both Mr. Trump and his staff and advisors repeatedly broadcast. And I stayed in close contact with these advisors to Mr. Trump. As such, I was aware of Mr. Trump's repeated disavowals of commercial and political ties between himself and Russia, his repeated statements that investigations of such ties were politically motivated and without evidence, and that any contact with Russian nationals by his campaign or the Trump Organization had all terminated before the Iowa caucus, which was on February 1st, 2016. In 2017, I was scheduled to appear before the Senate Intelligence Committee, as well as the House Intelligence Committee, concerning matters under their investigation, including principally whether Russia was involved in or interfered in the 2016 campaign and election. In connection with my appearances, I submitted a written statement to Congress, including, among other things, a description of a proposed real estate project in Moscow that I had worked on while I was employed by the Trump Organization. That description was false. I knew at the time. It was false in that I had asserted that all efforts concerning the project had ceased in January 2016, when in fact, they had continued through June of that year. It was also false when I asserted that I had very limited discussions with Mr. Trump and others in the company concerning the project, when in fact, I had more extensive communications. And it was false when I said I'd never agreed to travel to Russia in connection with the project and had never asked Mr. Trump to travel, when in fact I took steps to and had discussions with Mr. Trump about travel to Russia. He then says, I would like to note that I did not in fact travel there, nor have I ever been to Russia. He says, quote, I made these misstatements to be consistent with Mr. Trump's political messaging and out of loyalty to Mr. Trump. And at that point, it kind of feels like it's over. But it turns out he left something out, something that turns out to be important. And so the prosecution sort of jumps in to fill that in. So the judge at this point says, quote, any further allocution requested by the government? And the prosecutor from Special Counsel Robert Mueller's office, Rush Atkinson, he says, yes, Your Honor. As set forth in the criminal information, which is like an indictment, except you get criminal information when you plead guilty instead of going to trial. As set forth in the information, Mr. Cohen submitted in his statement falsely that upon reaching out to the Kremlin in January 2016 about the Moscow project, he had not received any response. In fact, he had received a response from the Kremlin. So in essence, Mr. Cohen minimized his contacts with the Russian government and stated so falsely in his submission. The judge says, you want that as part of this allocution? Rush Atkinson says, yes, please. And the judge says, Mr. Cohen, did you hear that? And Michael Cohen says, I did, Your Honor. And the judge says, well, is that correct? And Michael Cohen says, it is correct, Your Honor. There was one contact. The judge says, any further allocution requested by the government? The prosecutor says, no, Your Honor, thank you. And that's where we get to the curtain call. The judge says, quote, I find that Mr. Cohen is competent to proceed. I find that he understands the rights that he is waiving by pleading guilty. I further find that there is a factual basis for this plea, and I accept his plea of guilty. So today, the president's longtime personal lawyer, longtime executive at his business, pled guilty to a cover-up, a criminal cover-up. He pled guilty to lying to Congress about the extent of the real estate dealings that President Trump and his business were engaged in and pursuing in Russia with the help of the Kremlin while Trump was running for president, and while the Kremlin was simultaneously mounting an international military intelligence operation to skew our election in order to tilt it toward Trump.